Welcome to China Tech Talk, not even almost weekly anymore, podcast about technology here in China. I am John Artman, editor-in-chief of Techno.com, joined as always by Matthew Brennan, founder of ChinaChat. And so before we get into it, I just want to make a quick plug for the TechCrunch event that's coming up in the beginning of November. We are going back to Shenzhen for yet another conference. This time it's going to be bigger and better for a few different reasons. Number one, we are going to, for the first time in TechCrunch China history, we're going to have a hardware startup battlefield featuring local and international startups during the conference. We'll have some pretty good judges for that. And also, the TechNote English team is going to be organizing an Emerge side stage. And so we did Emerge back in May, and then we're bringing the same commitment to quality and the same commitment to depth for a different set of topics. We're going to be looking at China, India, C2M, and mass customization, as well as cloud gaming. And if you aren't already subscribed, make sure you do sign up for TechNode's newsletters. We send out several every week, some free, some if you're a member. But definitely sign up for our filtered free daily newsletter, and you can stay up to date with all that we're doing in the next few weeks and months. All right, plug over. Matt, we haven't done this in forever. I feel a bit rusty.
We've had a break. We've definitely had a break. But hey, I think that's fine. There's good reason for that. I did have a conference to do, which took over my life for a while, and but now it's back to normal, I guess you could say. And summertime as well, or kind of end of summer, I guess. Yeah, but it's good to be back, John. It's good to be back, and I think we're going to start up again doing more regular podcasts. So.
Yeah, exactly. I think before ChinaChat, which was really, really good, by the way, I ended up writing a column based on what I learned, not just at ChinaChat, but also some other conversations and events that I went to. But I have to say, for me, it was extremely educational. I think it was a little bit different from the year before last. I didn't go last year, but the year before last, there was there was some panels, there was some presentations, and a bit of a mix. Whereas this year, it felt like it was mostly presentations. And to be honest, I think that was a really good way to do it, because it's like I think panels are good. I mean, personally, I like doing panels because I enjoy conversation. But I think that for ChinaChat, having the presentations worked really, really well, because it just felt like, 2 afternoons of like an intensive digital marketing in China workshop. I think I ended up taking maybe like 4 or 5 pages of notes throughout both days. And yeah, anyway, I thought it was really, really good.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about panels is they're easy if you get very important people, right? So like they don't want to prepare a presentation. It takes time and effort to do that, right? So most conferences prefer panels, I think, for that reason. They're just easier to put together. As someone who does presentations and panels, panel, you don't need to prepare that much, right? You can just go in and maybe you need to know the questions in advance, and that's about it. Just check that they're okay and they're not going to ask anything, out of the scope of your knowledge. But with presentations, take a lot of effort to do a good one, so I think that's why. But the conference, I also have to do a presentation each year. I only do a short one because I'm not really there I'm more there for hosting. But this year I wanted to cover a topic which I felt it's actually a very interesting case here, because the topic we're going to cover today on this podcast is private traffic, or private domain traffic. It's called 私域流量 in Chinese. It's a red hot topic. It's been a red hot topic in China digital marketing and internet sector for the past half a year, at least. But there's been almost nothing written about it in English. There's been a very big disconnect between what people are talking about in the local market and then what people are covering around this. I think there's a couple of reasons for that, but it's really not received the level of coverage that it should have. Leading into it, I was expecting, any any week, do I really want to cover this in the conference? Because I'm sure other people will pick up on this and start writing about it, but actually not. So even today, it's still got relatively little. It seems to be a very local topic. Maybe it's a little bit difficult to understand, and certainly it's very, sort of marketers are very interested in it. And I think anyone who's in that space will be certainly wanting to know about it, but perhaps it's got less appeal outside of digital marketing as well.
Yeah, my sense is that it's slightly esoteric, and so coming from as a media worker, it's one of those things where I think that sometimes it's hard to find an angle for something like this.
Yeah.
So if we were doing like an explainer about something, then that would make a lot of sense. But it's esoteric. It's very niche. But then I think that as we'll discover in this conversation, that it's not too difficult to understand, or at least find some parallels in the Western world. And also, I feel like the topic of private traffic really kind of connects to an episode we did earlier this year with Rio, when we were talking about the death of the open web. And I think that these two kind of topics are really kind of just part of one bigger, larger trend, which is exactly that, which is moving away from the open web and having people, companies, marketers, salespeople owning traffic rather than having it something kind of like in the West where you have Google and you have your AdWords and all that stuff. But before we get really too deep into it, we do want to make sure that our listeners are on the same page. So Matt, how would you define private traffic? How do you explain it to people?
So it's a term that's really only used in China. Western digital marketers don't really use this term. The closest term that is used outside China is the concept of owned traffic. So owned traffic, when we talk about that in the States or in Europe, for example, we're typically talking about things like email lists or website traffic. The idea that you're not on a platform, right? You're not, your Facebook page, right, essentially is controlled by Facebook, and the traffic you receive to that Facebook page, you're at the mercy of that company and their algorithms in order to reach your followers, right? So typically you're going to have to pay to reach your followers. So that's not owned traffic, right? Owned traffic, the best example is an email list, right? So you'll use email is considered to be a direct link to your follower, to your fan. And as we've seen a big revival of this, right? I mean, TechNode is putting a lot of effort into email, right? And we've seen a big revival of email being considered a really good channel to reach people because it's direct. There's no gatekeeper, and you can have that relationship. And people are paying for subscriptions now, right? It's becoming more and more common that people find it acceptable to pay for an email newsletter, right? So this is very much something that I guess our listeners are familiar with.
Can I just want to interject.
And you have personal experience of, John, as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say, I think that, so and this is actually really parallel, and I didn't think of it until you mentioned it just now, but in the West, at least, it's been described as the dark forest of the internet. So where you can think of like public social media like Twitter or Facebook is kind of like the bright forest, if you will, or web pages and things like that. As Andrew Shore discussed in the opening presentation for ChinaChat, all of this like messaging in general and social media in general is moving more and more towards private conversations, private group chats, and then email is a big part of that. And so for us, I mean, as publishers, we're trying to follow where the market is going, right? Where people are more interested in receiving newsletters. It's a good way, as a reader myself, it's a good way to cut through the noise, but still make sure that you're keeping up to date. And especially so I subscribe to, for example, Ben Thompson and Bill Bishop. Ben Thompson is great because that way I can keep up with what's happening in the Valley as well as take a critical eye towards what's happening there. And then Bill Bishop is great because he aggregates all this different news and information and interjects his own opinion every once in a while into that. So it's a great way that I don't have to be on Twitter. I don't have to be following, 5,000 WeChat groups to be staying up to date, and which I think is the real kind of the real value for a lot of people. But Matt, I also had a question. So you mentioned that, this idea of owned traffic or, not having it owned by another platform. So for like a brand or for a marketer, why is that important? Like, why is it important to like own that traffic and not have it owned by the platform?
Yeah, I mean, the example of Facebook is sort of a classic one where organic reach on Facebook pages used to be, when brands started out investing into Facebook pages, you used to be able to reach a considerable proportion of your fans or followers without paying Facebook. Today, organic reach, if you have 1 million followers, you're probably going to be able to organically, without paying the platform, to reach maybe 1,000 of them, maybe 10,000 if you're something in that region. It's super low. And in China, this trend is exactly the same. Weibo is a great example. If you want to you could have there's plenty of brands, celebrities with very large followings on Weibo, and if they don't pay Weibo but they just want to put out a message to their fans and followers, they're only going to reach a tiny fraction of them. And what they pay platforms over time to reach their own followers increases. So actually in China, when we talk about private traffic, it's mostly a trend that we've seen play out strongest for e-commerce, for small and medium-sized e-commerce merchants in particular. So they are typically paying Alibaba. They're paying for traffic on Taobao, or they might be paying Jingdong, or they might also be paying Pinduoduo. It works the same for pretty much all of those platforms. If you want actually anyone to see your products and come to your store, you end up paying the gatekeeper. So every time you want people to come, so actually you keep paying the gatekeeper again and again and again, right? There's no, there are ways to get people, once they've bought something on your store, to maintain that relationship on the platform, but they're not ideal. It's sort of against the platform's interests to allow you to do that. So it's a great model for Alibaba. I mean, this is really the cash cow for Alibaba, right? This is how they make all of their money. It's called core commerce in the financial filings. And when we talk about a company like Alibaba, a lot of the news today is around things like Hema supermarkets and new retail, et cetera, that's sort of almost a sideline. It's almost a distraction in terms of like the core of Alibaba is that merchants in China need to pay Alibaba if they want to get traffic to their store. So those rates are just going up and up and up over time. The trend is super clear. And as a merchant, you're just being squeezed further and further every year, giving a larger percentage of your revenue to the platform. I think we had Eli on the podcast before, right? He described it. I remember saying, if you buy a Tmall store in China, you're essentially buying a store that's underground. And if you don't put any budget into promoting that store with the platform, nobody will come to your store. It's basically hidden. I think that's kind of true. I mean, unless someone actually is searching for your brand name, searching for you specifically, they're never going to find you unless you pay the gatekeeper.
Yeah, that reminds me a little bit about YouTube. So when it comes to social media or content, I used to at least watch YouTube a lot. Don't watch it as much as I used to. But one of the things that I noticed is that some YouTubers started talking about how YouTube was changing the discovery algorithm, basically. And I noticed this in my own experience as well, where YouTubers would say, subscribe, but then also hit the notification button. Because YouTube, earlier this year, they changed their recommendation algorithm, focusing a lot less on the channels that you subscribe to and just recommending content that's more similar to basically what you just watched or what you've been watching over the last couple of days. And this is so interesting because, as you were mentioning, it's becoming more like on Weibo, for example, it's becoming more expensive to reach your own followers, which is crazy if you think about it, because like Weibo and Twitter is kind of starting to implement these kind of recommendation algorithms recently. They got a lot of flack for not having it before, but the premise of these platforms was that you follow certain people and you receive their updates. And so to hear that you have to pay to actually, reach the people who already opted in to follow you sounds pretty crazy.
Yeah, but it's the reality. I think it's been the reality for quite some time. So there's a conflict from the platform. The platform's got incentivized to increase engagement, right? Every platform wants people to spend more time on that platform. They're going to see more ads, right? And you want to increase your daily active users and your monthly active users statistics. And then every platform's under pressure to monetize. So it's quite clear that there's a conflict there, because if you use algorithms to just surface content that's from anywhere, and you can pick from all of the content on your platform and just show the most relevant trending content that's hot today, actually, that's usually a better user experience than showing the content which the user has subscribed to previously. So this is great. It's not great, but it leads to typically a better user experience. But of course, the actual people who invest in building channels on those platforms, it's really a bad trend for them. And so, we see this in the East and the West across all these platforms, that there's this conflict between content creators or brands who are on the platform and the actual platform themselves. So the idea of private domain traffic is very similar to own traffic. You want to get a channel that belongs to you, that to reach your fans, to reach your followers, that's free. You don't pay a gatekeeper, you have direct access, and you can use it repeatedly. So like I said, in the West, that would be email, would be the best example, but also your website could be considered that. I mean, I think there is a gatekeeper there. Google typically is the gatekeeper for the open web, but Google does reward quality content over time. So this is concept that you can actually get very large amounts of organic traffic without paying Google if your content's good. And again, like Technode's a great example of that, I think. I mean, I imagine Technode.com gets a lot of organic traffic from Google without you having to pay anything.
Yeah, we don't pay Google anything. We have thought about it just because it would be good to increase our reach, and that's one way to do it. But we have some pretty good SEO juice on Google, and as you said, they actually do. I mean, I have a lot of bones to pick with Google, but I mean, when it comes to search, they still do a relatively good job. They are surfacing a lot more ads when you search these days at the top, which is kind of annoying. But they recently made a change to their SEO algorithm that prioritizes original content. And so I think when it comes to news and information, they really are taking it seriously in terms of trying to, I think on the one hand, dealing with the fake news backlash, but then on the other hand, really trying to serve their users in terms of surfacing relevant content from the open web. One of the things that they're doing, and that TechNode is probably going to be involved with, so in cooperation with WordPress, they are launching something called Newspack. It's all part of the Google News initiative, where they are spending real amounts of money trying to help small and medium publishers who are actually producing usually very niche content, but also high quality that they think needs to be encouraged and needs to be supported. So I think on that front, Google is doing a pretty good job. But let's kind of come back to China. So I guess, Matt, walk us through how the private traffic kind of, let's call it workflow. How does that look?
Yeah, a typical example. The example I brought up in the conference was a brand called Perfect Diary. And actually, they're basically a classic case study for private traffic in when Chinese people are talking, when Chinese marketers and e-commerce brands are talking about this concept. They're usually considered to be one of the best examples. Perfect Diary, for people who don't know, is actually a cosmetics brand. They're from Guangzhou. They're relatively new, and they're really, really killing it in China. By some measures on Tmall, I think their traffic is now larger than like L'Oreal and like very well-established old cosmetic brands that you would typically expect to be dominating a place like Tmall. This new upstart, relatively new upstart. I mean, I got a feeling they're about 4 years old, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But they're using all these kind of new marketing tactics. You know, L'Oreal being a Western brand most Western brands look at private traffic and the sort of techniques I'm about to describe as risky, and they're a little bit hesitant to use it. But Perfect Diary has really been fully embracing this. They're known for having over 1 million followers on private traffic channels in China, what they call a private traffic pool. And those followers are actually, those 1 million followers are basically all on WeChat personal accounts. So the classic way to do private traffic in China, given that email is not an effective channel to reach most Chinese people, given that the open web is perhaps you have to pay Baidu. So whereas we've just been talking about Google being relatively open, in China, Baidu is pay to play. So if you want to drive traffic, it doesn't really matter how good your content is, Baidu, unless you pay them, you're not going to get any serious traffic from Baidu. And the open web is just less important. People don't go to browsers as much in China. It tends to be an app economy, very mobile centric. And so that leans itself to like WeChat being the best place to do this. So when we talk about private traffic in China, usually we're talking about adding followers onto a private personal WeChat account, which has a limit, right? WeChat accounts, you can't add like 1 million followers onto a personal WeChat account. The limit's about 5,000. So you've only got 5,000 per account, and then you have to open a new account. So it's a very, very manual, annoying process if you're doing this without some technology to help you. But there are brands doing this for sure, where they are using phones with multiple WeChat accounts on one phone. There are ways to do that are legal. You can actually, there's many Android brands that allow you to mirror apps on your phone and have like two versions of the same app on your phone. That's totally fine. You can actually log in and log out of different accounts through one WeChat app on a phone. That's also totally fine. And you can register different accounts under different phone numbers for one person in China. So there are ways to do that, which are quite manual and a little bit awkward, but it's possible for one individual to have multiple WeChat accounts and run those from a phone and still not be doing anything dodgy, not using any special software to hack the system. But it's incredibly manual, it's incredibly time-consuming to do that. And so, but that's what brands are doing. That's what Perfect Diary is doing. And once you have them on your personal WeChat account, then you add them into a WeChat group. And again, groups also have a limit, right? So you've got the WeChat group limit's 500. So if you were Perfect Diary, you add 5,000 of your followers from onto an account, and then you would put those into groups, and you'd be running multiple WeChat groups. And in those WeChat groups, you're basically creating a sort of vibe of an environment where people can learn about your brand. So you're posting useful information in there. You're definitely doing content marketing, but you're also encouraging sales and people to make repeat purchases. So for Perfect Diary, what they do is like when you actually buy one of their cosmetics products, and they send it to you. So you're typically buying that on Taobao or Tmall. And then when they actually send it to you, there's a card they send along with it with an offer that's fairly attractive and most people would be interested in, where you can get a discount, you can get a code if you add them on WeChat and you add the personal account on WeChat. The personal account doesn't go to the brand, it goes to this Xiaowan, this sort of imaginary woman. She's a figurehead, as it were. Like she's not a real, or she is a real person. The picture's a real person, but like the name is made up. But it feels like a real person. It's meant to feel like you're connecting with this woman who's also using these products and representing the brand to some extent. And she adds you to the group, and she will be the one posting this information to you. And I'm in these groups. I've checked it out. It's quite interesting what they do. There's all different types of content in there, and there really is a sort of like a vibe that they create in the group, a sort of atmosphere of sharing tips and hints. And people share their own pictures of what they've done with the makeup, etc. in there. And so there is a community atmosphere, and this is quite like well known and an established marketing tactic. I think that people use for all different kinds of things. Like again, like TechNode's a good example, right? TechNode has WeChat groups, right, where you guys share your articles, and there is a community built around those WeChat groups, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because traditional publication models don't really work on WeChat. And official accounts are a real pain in the butt. Let me tell you something. I mean, the back end is just horrendous. I mean, the amount of time that I've spent on just like individual posts that take us, 2 minutes to publish on WordPress can take, up to 30 minutes just to get ready on the official account backend, which is one of the reasons why we stopped updating our official account often. We built out a mini program, and so on WeChat, what we do is we just share the article, both a URL to our website as well as the mini program itself, and it's worked out pretty well. It's really amazing. Like you make it easy for people, and so for us, I mean, like what we care most about is eyeballs, right? And so and we found that the WeChat group, the Friends of TechNode WeChat group, is the best way to do that because it's all opt-in. Instead of pushing our content to some nameless mass of people at some point for some reason decided to follow our official account, people are actively opting in to our WeChat group. And every once in a while, less so these days than in the beginning, but every once in a while I'll go through and I'll just remove people from the group, people who haven't participated in quite some time, and I'll usually give a notice, say, hey, I'm gonna be deleting people from the group. If you want to stay in, change your name to something or include something in your group handle, and so then give people some time to do that. Give them some notice, and then start taking people out once that timeline is up. And so again, it's a great way to make sure that the opt-in, that people are still opting in, that they're still interested, that they're actually engaging with us and with our content. But this is kind of the interesting thing. I mean, so, I was doing some research for a piece on EdTech that I did maybe about a month ago or so. And because I was looking at what ByteDance is doing in that space. And Matt, maybe you and I can record an episode about that at some point. I think it's super interesting. But it's really interesting because basically what you're describing, what Perfect Diary does, is actually really similar to what one of the ByteDance apps does as well. And I can't remember which one it is. They have they have a bunch. But basically it was really similar, where you sign up for this course, and the course is it can be one-on-one, or it could be, like a group course or something like that. But a lot of the actual interaction happens on WeChat. And so what you do is you add a certain person similar to Xiao Yuanzi, and then they start talking to you and saying, hey, you can try this or you can try that. And of course, at the end of the day, they want to get you into a group chat. I never went that far just because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to be bugged all the time by unsolicited marketing messages for English courses that I don't need. But I think it's really, really interesting because WeChat, it really is taking up more space in terms of I think, transactions for Chinese companies. And this reminds me of a piece that we published back in 2017, where Eva Yu, she did a profile on a company that was out of China Accelerator. And one of the most interesting things about this company, and it's very similar to how you described what Perfect Diary does, but at that time they weren't using private traffic. But what they did was almost all of their marketing efforts were outside of WeChat. So they were using Douban, they were using Keep, they were using Weibo. I mean, basically any possible social media platform that had a relevant audience, they would put all of their marketing into. But then the actual conversion, the actual transaction would take place on WeChat through the Weishang. And this is Matt. This is what I wanted to ask you about. Is, and I think that even in your presentation, you made this comparison. So, like, what is the difference then between back in 2017, where people were pushing conversions to WeChat on Weishang, and now with the private traffic? What's the difference between these two phenomena?
Yeah, so Weishang is the sort of similar to this, but actually different in quite a few respects. But the key difference, I believe, is mini programs have just made e-commerce on WeChat, particularly in WeChat groups, much, much more viable. And they've really helped to make that user experience work. And so a lot of this private traffic stuff is about repeat purchases. So you're making your initial purchase on an e-commerce platform like Tmall, and then you're driving this follower, you're incentivizing this follower to get into this group, add you on a personal account, join this group, and then within that group, the mini program allows you to make the repeat purchase really simple and fast. Whereas maybe a couple of years ago, before mini programs really took off in China, you would have to do that through a web page, or you might have to do it through a direct transaction. It was still possible for sure, but it was nowhere near as easy as it is now with what Perfect Diary does. All of these transactions, that they're repeat purchases that they're driving through WeChat groups, is all done on mini programs. So they have the freedom there to build whatever they want in terms of content and create basically a website, a web page there through the mini program that completely customizable, really simple to build and fast and easy to change. From the user experience, it's really, tap, 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 and I've bought it. So that's a pretty big deal. When it comes to conversion, that stuff is really important.
So when it comes to the mini programs, let's stick with Perfect Diary. So the mini programs that Perfect Diary are using, those are the ones. These are mini programs that they've developed themselves. Because like JD, for example, and Pinduoduo, if you're a merchant, they can help you build mini programs. So is Perfect Diary, is all the MPs that's kind of in-house?
Yeah.
And they're keeping
all. It's basically it's under their brand, built by them. They're big enough, right? So they need to be doing everything in-house for this, I would imagine, rather than using third-party services like you just mentioned. And then so they control the data, they can control the user experience like exactly how they wish. And they have complete control over pretty much everything that's happening once you click through onto that mini program. So, and then the mini programs are great for social sharing as well. So, like, you can do a lot of flash sales, you can do a lot of group buy, all of these models which are quite flourishing actually in the past few years of social e-commerce and content-driven e-commerce are all possible. So you really got a very sort of flexible environment where you can take these people who've bought your product before, right? You've got a group of 500 people who have all very qualified. They've all purchased your products before, and then you can at them. You can send a message that everyone in the group will have to see because you're the host. You're controlling it, and send them a mini program which can be tailored towards the people in that group and exactly what they've purchased before, because you'll segment these groups based on pretty much like what products did they buy to actually convert over into WeChat. And then your best practice would be tagging as well. So you'll tag the actual people in the group based on what have they bought before, what have they said, how engaged they are, etc., etc. All these different activities. It's also possible to do tagging and then one-on-one send them information as well outside the group. So there's a lot of possibilities here. In fact, there was a report, one of the few resources in English about this topic was put out last year by a Boston Consulting Group and Tencent, a report called Winning in the Age of Social Media. And it actually describes 3 different models in detail around how this can work. And actually, it's funny, the report doesn't even mention private traffic as a term, because when it came out last year, actually, this term hadn't yet been formed. But actually, it's definitely talking about this concept. That's exactly what it's covering. And so, yeah, there's different models for it. There's ones that are a little bit similar to Weisheng, where it's, you're just pushing content to them and hoping that they buy. There's ones where it's a bit more like you're providing expert advice to the followers around a topic. So that would lend itself towards products where it's a higher price point and there's more education that needs to happen in the consumer in order to make the purchase. A good example would be something like mother and baby WeChat groups, where there's a lot of questions from new mothers. And then you can actually have someone running that group for your brand and hopefully providing some useful advice in there as well. And then there's a third model, which is sort of personal companion, which is even more, it's like a sort of one-on-one relationship, less group orientated, but more like a concierge service. And that works well for really high priced services and goods. And, an example of that would be maybe education, which is a pretty high ticket price industry typically in China. And you might be, adding them into WeChat and keeping that relationship and cultivating that customer on a one-on-one sort of relationship rather than a group, which is extremely manual and extremely time consuming. But if they're making a sale of signing up for a university in the UK and you're the agent, that's an extremely high ticket price. Or if they're buying a house or a car, that can still make a lot of sense to do that.
Yeah, that's the thing about a lot of this private traffic that I was really surprised by, or at least I think if you think about, as you were saying, amount of work that goes into providing a more personalized kind of, let's call it even maybe intimate service to people via WeChat, whether it's one-to-one or groups. It takes a lot of work. And so I was really surprised to learn that a lot of this stuff, like Perfect Diary, for example, it's still manual.
Yeah.
I think that there are some ways to kind of create efficiencies, but like we're not talking about chatbots, right? We're not talking about, any kind of new technology or like kind of super innovative technology being applied to actually make this work. At the end of the day, it's still, humans working on these behind a lot of these accounts. And so as you were saying, you can have multiple WeChat accounts on one phone, but then you also have, one person managing multiple different phones. And so they might be managing, I don't even know, Matt, maybe you can fact check me on this, but like 20 different phones with like 5 different accounts on them at one time. And so these brands like Perfect Diary or another service company, they still have to have people on the back end actually typing out this stuff and forwarding it around and kind of creating the content itself. And so it's still very, very human intensive.
Yeah, I think Perfect Diary is probably automating a lot of this and has structures in place to make it a little bit better than what you've just described. But having said that, for small e-commerce brands, yeah, I imagine it probably is quite similar to that. In fact, we've got, I've seen videos of similar things to what you described. One e-commerce brands where they've got workers, each with 6 or 8 phones, and they're managing WeChat groups manually in there to take orders. It seems very intensive work, actually. But the thing is, if you're using a chatbot, let's say, if you're using some kind of automation in order to run personal accounts on WeChat, that's against the terms of service. So it's possible, and people do it for sure. It's risky because actually WeChat will shut those accounts down over time. There's a sort of game of cat and mouse between people who want to automate personal WeChat accounts and open up millions of WeChat accounts and run those with software in order to do marketing, do various activities. It could be, simulating engagement on articles, which people will pay for, brands will pay for. It could be using private traffic. There's multiple ways that you can monetize a large number of WeChat accounts, which can be controlled remotely through software. And this business, typically called click farming, is quite well documented. I think last year in 2018, there was actually quite a lot of it. It was quite a hot topic in China. This year it's cooled off considerably because WeChat has taken such strong measures against this kind of behavior. And I think that's actually one of the reasons maybe our listeners some of them have definitely reached out to me to ask this kind of question, because in the last year or so for WeChat, it's become very difficult to actually open and verify a foreign WeChat account in certain countries. And the reason for that is because of this private traffic trend, where if e-commerce brands, if click farms want to, open up 100,000 WeChat accounts, the easiest way to do that is to open those accounts outside China using in a place where Tencent doesn't have that much control. In China, every WeChat account is linked to an ID in some way.
Yeah.
Right? So today, it's very difficult to actually do this in China without linking it to a personal ID card.
Something similar happened to my mom recently, or earlier this year, where I finally convinced her to download WeChat and then make an account so that, it would be easier for us to communicate, but then also for my wife to share updates and pictures with the kids, because I'm notoriously very bad at doing that. And then, a week goes by, everything seems kind of normal. We hadn't really been using it very much. And then I tried to send her a message and WeChat said this account has been suspended. And it's like, what the heck is going on? But I think this is true for a lot of different services in China. And if you think about it from an enforcement perspective, it makes so much sense because, as you mentioned, everything is tied to an ID number, and these ID numbers are unique. They can be verified somehow. Whereas, I could probably just make up a random string of, 6 to 8 numbers and letters and put them in as my passport number, and Tencent or whoever else, they really have no way to verify whether or not this is genuine. So because of that, and because people do take advantage of that in China, they have to be pretty strict about how they enforce and make sure that people aren't engaging in fraudulent activity of some kind. But also, Matt, I wanted to ask, so when it comes to private traffic in general, so not necessarily kind of bot-driven, personal accounts, but just like private traffic in general, I mean, how does WeChat and Tencent, how do they think about this? Is this something that they encourage and that they think is good for them, or is it something that they're trying to maybe control or clamp down on?
Yeah, so good question. I think from Tencent's perspective, they kind of have a love-hate relationship with it. There's two conflicting things. So one is that actually this trend is pretty good for Tencent because, as we mentioned earlier, the goal for these brands is to drive repeat purchases on mini programs typically. That's great. Tencent actually makes money from that, right? They take a small cut when you use WeChat Pay. And it hurts Alibaba because now, that's not a channel which they can control, and it reduces these e-commerce brands' dependence on that ecosystem. They don't need to pay Alibaba so much. So that trend in terms of, and also from the user perspective as well, the more people become familiar with mini programs and buying on mini programs and how they work, that's absolutely awesome for Tencent. That's exactly what they want. So that part's great, and they definitely would love to encourage that. On the other side, this behavior is quite clearly, against terms of service. It's kind of, when you're talking about automating millions of WeChat accounts, this is illegal. It's quite clearly going to lead to a poor user experience. People are going to get frustrated. And you do see that around users, people complaining that they get brought into groups which they don't know anyone in, and suddenly they're being sent marketing messages and being spammed. This can have some very serious consequences for user experience. I think as non-Chinese WeChat users, not typically non-Chinese WeChat users are really not exposed to this kind of behavior that much at all. But when you talk to local Chinese, pretty much everyone's had some kind of bad experience on WeChat with people trying to market to them. And a lot of this back in the day was the Weisheng phenomenon, which are individual sellers who were using WeChat moments and other and WeChat groups as well to sell products that maybe they've brought abroad or something like that. But there's many years history here of like people feeling that WeChat is a place that has been overly commercialized by individuals trying to sell stuff to you. And it's really something that people don't like. And then, there's using things like WeChat Pay with these millions of fake accounts. If they're running transactions through those in some way, that's risky for WeChat Pay. That is, that could be used for money laundering. It could be used for gambling. They really have no control over it once now you've got third-party platforms automating all this behavior on the platform. There's definitely risk there as well. So there's these two conflicting elements, and overall it seems to be that Tencent is taking steps to clamp down on this behavior. And that's why, as foreign WeChat users, your story about your mother there, John, is pretty typical. A lot of people are discovering now that non-active WeChat accounts outside China tend to get shut down, and re-verifying them is an annoying and sometimes complex process. But I think I can understand why Tencent's doing that, and certainly for them, that's also got a negative of reducing the number of people who use WeChat, which is typically not what a platform would want to do.
Yeah, exactly. To a previous point that you were making, there was a point last year where I started to get random people trying to add me as a friend. Like, I have no idea who they are. They have some weird kind of flower stuff in their name and some emoticons and emojis, and it's just like totally random. So what I did is I disabled people being able to discover my account through my phone number. The number of random friend requests dropped to 0. Basically, but I think that does validate what you were saying before, and I guess I think we're coming close to time, but you're talking about Tencent this is good for Tencent in a certain sense because it's allowing merchants to not be dependent on platforms like Taobao. So I guess is Alibaba, are these kind of big platforms that are being affected negatively by private traffic, are they doing anything about this? Is there any response from them that we can see?
Yeah, I think Taobao is taking steps to enable this kind of behavior to happen on their platform as well. And so there are sort of ways that you can subscribe. Basically, you can subscribe to shops, and there's a feed where you can, in Taobao, where you can actually just see updates from those stores which you're interested in. That's not algorithmically curated for you. Interestingly, there's one point, you could do a whole episode on this, but it's Taobao in general and Tmall, by far the largest e-commerce players in China for marketplace-driven e-commerce. Today, most traffic is actually coming from content, algorithmically suggested content and live stream, and not from search, which is a really interesting phenomenon that you would not expect that, right? Because the traditional e-commerce user experience is let's just say Amazon as an example. You go to Amazon and you type what you want into that search bar and then select from what it gives you. It's a search-driven experience. What we're seeing in China is today already content and algorithmically suggested feed, which if you go to Taobao today, and it's mostly actually it's a feed, you just scroll down, and it suggests items to you, And then there's a lot of content built around the experience of like video content and live stream in there as well. That Taobao's actually made a very successful transition into embracing content-driven e-commerce. And today it's a case where that's where the majority of purchases are taking place. So Taobao's doing a lot, actually. Alibaba's doing a lot to sort of try and embrace this trend. However, it's kind of fundamentally against their business model, right? Like, that's the problem, is that they are incentivized to monetize this in terms of they completely control all of the traffic on those apps, and how they actually make their money, and they're under pressure from investors and shareholders to do more and more of this, is to squeeze those brands, is to get them so that they have to pay the platform for, somehow in order to drive sales. If they offer channels which are free, that's going to hurt their business. It's pretty much, there's a very difficult, way. It's pretty impossible for them to get around that, I feel. So yeah, it's not too, I mean, I don't want to mislead you into thinking Taobao's doing nothing and Alibaba is not trying to create. There's actually a lot to talk about there in terms of how e-commerce is changing on those platforms, but there still remains this fundamental conflict there, I think. Whereas WeChat and Tencent has a different model, and they're happy with just taking market share away from Alibaba, basically.
Exactly. But I think it's all part of a much broader trend. I mean, I think in Alibaba and Taobao, they're relatively, so they jumped on board like the content-powered e-commerce when live streaming was relatively mature. I mean, they own a large stake in Weibo now, and Weibo, they have their Yizhibo as well as a few other video products. Taobao has its own live streaming platform, as you mentioned. And so it's just really interesting because like the killer monetization model for China has become e-commerce. You take things like Xiaohongshu, Mogujie, and a few other ones. And a lot of these companies, they actually started off as kind of like recommendation or social media or something like that. And then at one point, they were finding it very difficult to monetize until they realized that, well, let's just start selling stuff and figuring out how we can make money from selling stuff through our KOLs and users and things. And that's proven to be like the way to do it. And as we discovered at ChinaChat as well, there's all these, super niche platforms, social media platforms that are monetizing through e-commerce as well. And KOL marketing and content marketing. And so it's really fascinating to see how all of that is playing out. And it's becoming more private. It's becoming more niche, less accessible, less searchable from the outside. But at the end of the day, that seems like kind of how the whole internet is kind of going, where like in the West, people are getting super tired of Facebook. They're getting very tired of the toxicity on Twitter. And so they're moving more and more towards these private group chats mostly, and then newsletters and all these other things. And so it's super interesting to see how, the Chinese internet, which is isolated for various reasons from the rest of the internet, is still kind of moving in parallel. And so it's hard to say, is a trend in China being kind of copied or learned from in the West, which I do think is happening. But it's hard to say, is that actually happening in this case or not? But certainly, it's just super interesting to see the parallels and how more parallel they are than they're not, given the amount of isolation between the two ecosystems.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, so we're going to leave it there. I think that there's a lot still to kind of to talk about, but I think we would be probably just going into the weeds and going off track. So we're going to leave it there. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you gave us a review on iTunes. It helps us to become more visible to other iTunes and podcast listeners who are interested in tech in China. And as always, if you want to stay up to date with technology in China, the best way to do that is to subscribe to TechNode newsletters. You can do that at technode.com/newsletters.